Okay, we are ready to start the 10th chapter of the book of Romans.
Wait a second.
Remember, now Paul in this section is, up until now, he has been making an exposition that showed that the death of the Messiah was in God's plan from the beginning, that there would be righteousness based on the Messiah's suffering and exaltation. And that's the gospel, that's the good news that has happened. Now he's gone back and he is talking about the history of Israel. Now this is a very common way that Jewish writers did. You remember when Stephen preached, he rehearsed the history of the Jews. The 78th Psalm is a recounting of the history of the Jews.
Moses did the same thing for the Jews that went into the Promised Land.
Yes, and it is what it is. It's to remind them that they are a covenant people, and that as a covenant people, God had a purpose for them. And it was a purpose, as we've talked about already. It wasn't to grant them privileges. We tend to think, and it makes us think that God is unfair, that he would select somebody to be privileged. He does not do that. He selects them to do his will.
Which is a privilege.
What?
Which is a privilege.
Yeah. Well, but it doesn't always feel like a privilege. Because it can result in persecution. It can result in what I'm just talking about to the apostles. So, what he is saying here is that the Jews never understood why God had chosen them. They took it to be that God was giving them superior status, and they felt invulnerable. See, it started, you've heard Max's sermon of this weekend, it started with the conquering of the Promised Land. They got this feeling that God is for us, who can be against us? Now, that's a comforting idea, but it is very easily to corrupt, because God is with us only, well, that's not the best way to put it. It's not, yes?
How does the word chosen translate directly from the Hebrew?
It just means selected.
Okay, so they wouldn't have interpreted that as being supreme. They misinterpreted the
Yes.
Okay.
When the prophets were telling them that if they didn't straighten up, God was going to destroy their nation and the temple. And they said, no way. God chose us. He's on our side. Our God fights for us. Nobody can win against us. And they took it in a racial superiority mode. Now, you find in the book of Romans both defenses of the Jews and an analysis that shows their weaknesses and failings. N.T. Wright suggests that the church in Rome, being made up almost completely with Gentiles, and at the seat of Roman power, had a tendency to anti-Semitism. Remember, the Jews had been thrown out of Rome at the time of the Emperor Claudius, and they did not go back until Claudius was dead. And there was this latent anti-Semitism in the government circles in Rome. We usually think, that they allowed the Jews for religious freedom. They did, but they didn't want to live next to them.
Separate but equal.
Yeah, separate but unequal. But anyway, that's what Paul is doing here. He wants to use the Roman church as his supporting church to evangelize the western part of the Roman Empire. But he didn't want a church that didn't understand his missionary principle. What was his missionary principle?
To the Jews first and then the Gentiles?
Yes. The Jew first and then the Gentiles. And he's going to work that out here. And as he gets into this, 9, 10, and 11, he is rehearsing the history of the Jews and the covenant, how God remained faithful to his covenant even though his chosen people did not. But he's going to warn us Gentiles that doesn't mean that we don't have any obligation toward Jews, that we don't, we can just, now that the church is predominantly Gentile, we don't have to be concerned with the Jews. But Paul severely criticizes that before he gets through here. I've been trying to lead up to that because he's hinted at it before when he says, it was through the failure of the Jews that the Gentiles had their opportunity. And he's going to be more blunt than that in this section. Now, by the way, I do not, and again I'm with N.T. Wright and a lot of modern scholars, I do not think that this section ends up with the prediction of all the Jews going to be converted as part of the end time, which dispensationalists and fundamentalists do. And I don't believe that. By the way, W.T., that's part of what you were thinking about. We'll deal with that. Okay, he starts out, my heart's desire, my fellow believers, my heart's desire on behalf of my biological kinspeople is that they be saved. Now, he wants it understood that his commission to preach the gospel to the Gentiles did not make him just ignore his kinspeople. His very soul was involved in seeing his kinspeople. And he always, in every city, literally went to the Jews first. You remember, those of you who were with us when we studied the book of Acts, how he would, in Philippi, there wasn't even a synagogue. You remember what happened? He heard that there was a Jewish place of prayer out on the river. And so on the Sabbath, we went there, Luke says. And in all of the places other that he went, if there was a synagogue, he went there first. And he preached there as long as the Jews would let him. He did not ever turn from preaching the gospel to the Jews. He was driven away. So Paul wants them to realize that he recognized the weakness and the sinfulness, and the sinfulness is not moral immorality. The Jews had one of the highest moral levels in the ancient world. In fact, that's what attracted many Gentiles to attached themselves to a Jewish synagogue was the moral superiority of the Jews. So when Paul says about the sin of the Jews, he's not talking about immoral, issues of stealing, sexual purity, that kind of thing, because they did that well. He is talking about their failure to understand what God was doing with them through the covenant. As he says, I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but it is a zeal not based on knowledge. They disregarded the being made right that comes from God and attempted to erect one of their own. That is, even under the law, the principle was that God made people right, included them in the covenant by grace.
Right.
See, Paul's idea about salvation by faith, grace through faith, was God, he makes it clear, that was always the principle that God worked on. Not just, but it became reality for all people when the Messiah took on himself all the sins of all the people and made an atoning sacrifice. As I like to point out, when the Godhead took evil and sin into itself, and they were so good that evil could not affect them. By the way, that's what happened in the Garden of Eden, when God said, don't eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because he knew that we human beings could not experience, that is, know about real evil without it corrupting us. Only God can do that. Only God, my metaphor is of a big cold lake, and you throw a match in it. That's just a metaphorical image to keep in your mind. That's what happened on the cross. He became sin, and therefore he extinguished the power of sin and the results and consequences of sin. Now, the Jews couldn't grasp that. They were too much caught up with the idea that we are right because we're God's people. We have the temple. One of the prophets of old said, don't say the temple, we have the temple. I believe it's Amos, but I'm not sure.
Charles, isn't there a little bit of that goes on today in Christianity when people want to buy into this predestiny type idea that they are considering themselves chosen and selected and special, and therefore they don't have to really worry about exactly what God's grace is going to do for them.
This is what N.T. Wright calls triumphalism. That we can carry this idea of that God has made us right and told us what the verdict is going to be at the day of judgment. We can turn that into, well, look how good I am. And he warns against that.
And I think that we build our own temples. We want to feel like we're responsible for what our salvation.
Yes.
And so we build that and say, this is how you do it.
Mhm.
If you don't do it this way, then you're not saved.
Yes.
And that is the
It's just repeating the same mistake that started with Adam. It all goes back to Adam.
The day of the triumphal entry.
What?
It's very much contrasted when, at the end of that day, Christ cried and prayed over Jerusalem. Because they even though they praised him, it was an empty praise because their hearts were not
Okay.
given to him.
They praised him for what?
to save them politically from Rome.
That they said, "Hail to the King of the Jews." And before the week, before several, just next day, as it were, they said, "Crucify him, crucify him." "What shall I do with the King of the Jews?" Pilate said, and they say, "Crucify him." See, they realized at some level that he wasn't going to do what they wanted him to do, and therefore he couldn't be their Messiah. But that rejection had gone on nearly since the formation of the Israel as a country and a kingdom.
In all fairness to the Jews, though, like talking about Joshua bringing down nations and stuff, they had a history of God conquering
So do we.
through war, you know, so, I mean, it's easy to understand how they would expect a Messiah to bring down Rome the way they did the other.
Well, here's the thing. Just because it's reasonable,
Well, I
Is-
agree, but, you know.
no,
They're human
yeah,
beings.
it's easy to understand. But what Paul wants us to understand as Gentile believers, and he's going to get to that before the 11th chapter is finished, that we have as great a temptation to make our inclusion in the new covenant as much personal and triumphal as the Jews did. And he warns against doing that. Because it's not us. You remember the series that Max preached, I don't know, 10 years ago? It's not about me.
Right.
But notice how rampant that is. Most of the socio-political and economic problems we have in this country today is caused by a self-centered narcissism that says it's all about me. You know, I want the government to do what will benefit me. Don't you see that? And it's not a matter of whether you're liberal or conservative. Both camps want to have the government act in their behalf. And it's the same way. I don't want to go too far there because I don't think it's this is the place to discuss political ideology. But it is certainly the place to talk about it's not about me, and it's about God and God's will and God's doing and God's salvation. Seek first the kingdom of God, and these things, which were food, clothing, shelter, like that, will be given you on the side, as it were. Now, that's not a promise that you'll never go hungry or never go unclothed. That's just a statement of fact. You need to seek God's kingdom, God's rule first, and then these things will maybe not be as many of them as you want, but usually as many of them as you need will be.
I just wanted to add that I was teaching Saudis this week, and their culture is very corporate in nature, and I don't know, in the Sudan you probably see that too with the people, that their culture is very corporate, that everyone has a place in the culture. And so the self-centered narcissism, I think, is really an outgrowth of the U.S. individualism that we have that's so prevalent. And I just noticed that they just had a hard time sometimes picking up on what this was. It's so foreign to their mentality.
Yeah, yes, that is true, that they had a great deal of the idea of belonging in a group. And by the way, that's what Paul is talking about here. He's talking about the corporate life. And we find it difficult because and you're right, the idea of narcissism coming in is just a growing up of a tendency that's been in this country. Our ancestors came here in order to have their way. And the ideal is, John Wayne on his own, or Billy the Kid, or
The Lone Ranger.
the Lone Ranger. Yeah. Notice, the Lone Ranger. And so it's, as Herman used to know a man talking, it's gone to seed. It stopped being a green plant and gone to seed. And we could go on this way, but let's stick with this analysis. I'm glad that you can see the relevancy of this principle that Paul is talking about here in other areas than just in the church. But again, this is not the place to discuss socio-political things except as God directly addresses himself to it. Okay. They failed because the goal of the law is Christ, so that there may be a being made right for everyone who believes. Now, he has already said that the goal of God's covenant was a being made right for everybody. Remember the twofold promise made to Abraham in the 12th chapter of Genesis? By the way, this is God's plan for undoing Adamic sin. He called Abraham out and he said two things. I'll make of you a great nation. Your descendants will be a great nation. And through your descendants, all nations of the world will be blessed. Now, that's the part they forgot. They took that first part, will be a great nation. But they did not take on the responsibility of acting in a way that the nations would be blessed. In fact, they made sure there was very little contact at the social, economic level. The idea of the Pharisees was to draw a line, a wall around Jews that kept them from being contaminated by those Gentiles.
That was a directive from God.
What?
Wasn't that a directive from God? Not to marry into the Gentile nation and
Yeah,
to keep
but
themselves separate?
you have to put that, here's the thing. Yes, because he knew of the corrupting power, but they were supposed to behave toward the Gentiles in a way to save them. Just like Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians when he said, I wrote you in a previous letter that you should not associate socially with the immoral people. Not by any means meaning the immoral people in the world, because if you did that, you would have to withdraw from the world. We are to be the light of the world. We're to be the salt of the earth. We are to behave in a way that when people see our good works, they will praise not us, but God. And notice he was talking to Jews when he said that. See, you have to be in the world, but not of the world. And that's deucedly hard. It really is.
When Solomon's temple was built, did it have the court of the women and the court of the Gentiles around it? Or was that something that came up in the second Herod's temple?
Why don't you ask me a question I know the answer to?
Let's talk about that. I was wondering how open the temple was to everyone.
It wasn't. I don't know, I cannot be sure, because I've never done the research, that they had that little partition wall. But I suspect they did. But I'm not sure. I've never seen anything about that. Because the Jews were always exclusivistic. But we should not be surprised about that. When I came to Oak Hills in 1971, there was very, very few Hispanics and no black people at all. I set that as my goal. And when after 10 years, we had made some headway. And then, thank God, God sent us 2 preachers in a row, ending with Max, that had an agenda of inclusivism. And that means go out and preach the gospel to everyone. I've told you this, to sit and watch the worship center disgorge itself after a worship. And we come out of there, black and white and somewhere in between. We have couples that are mixed race, both directions. Black woman and a white man, white woman and a black man. My heart leaps up when I see that, because the church ought to be a picture of this socioeconomically of the community it's in. But it ought to be a community of believers hewing to a high moral standard and a loving relationship with the people of the world. And that's what Paul is talking about. The Jews missed that. Now, he's not talking about individual sins of individual Jews. He's talking collectively or communally. They failed because they were ignorant of what God had in mind for them. They believed that God called them out to enjoy the blessings, a land flowing with milk and honey. Or as Max said in the sermon this weekend, it had where the rocks were made out of copper and iron. You know what? If I ever had read that scripture, and I know I have, I don't remember it. And I always think of milk and honey, but given what's needed for a commercial, yes, and it is. It had copper and iron that was available to them. I've seen in Israel an iron smelter excavated in the early Iron Age, which is just about the time that David that's when the Iron Age began. And it began in Illyricum, or what's present day was Yugoslavia, and now it's the Serbians and everybody, Montenegrins and all. They can't decide whether they want to be in one country or 6. And they're still squabbling over there. Okay. They failed because the goal of the law is Christ, so that there may be a being made right for everyone. See, if being made right was strictly the matter of keeping the Torah, only the Jews could be saved. And that's what they thought. And it came over. That's what was going on with the Galatian churches. That's the reason Paul went back to the covenant with Abraham and said, look, from the beginning, God intended to save Gentiles. Now that was a bitter pill for the Jews. In fact, Paul is going to say that maybe that God did that in order to make the Jews jealous enough that we Gentiles have been selected and have the covenant. Maybe enough of them would be jealous. But he also suggests something else, and I'm going to preview this, that it is we Gentile Christians ought to act in a way that would make Jewish people want to join us. At the sitting close to us, not 2 weeks ago Friday, when Mike and I went to hear N.T. Wright speak, there was a Jewish rabbi behind us, very young man. He wasn't a Jews for Jesus either. And I just thought, now here is what God intended for us to do and be, working with our Jewish fellow human beings to try to bring them to faith in Christ. Think about that. Max is now with a group in Israel, and one of the things they'll do is visit with, and oh my goodness, when did I start down that trail? I can't remember the fellow's name. He's preached here. Joe Shulam, got it, who is a practicing Christian believer in Jerusalem. And he has friends and people that he has influenced, both in the Christian community and in the Jewish community of believers. So there's hints of it. I'm not sure of this, but I suspect that one of the things that God would want us to be supporting is the so-called Jews for Jesus movement. I'm not going to say that's the answer to the problem, but it's the best one that I know of to accomplish God's purposes. Okay, he said, Moses wrote concerning being made right by the law, the person who does these things will live. Now, notice he's going back to Moses, the law. And what the idea is, Moses said, if you keep the law, you will live. But he has demonstrated in the first chapters of the book of Romans that the Jews did not keep the law. That comes down to the famous passage in the 3rd chapter that says, there's not one righteous. No, not one. All have sinned. And that all includes Jew, Gentile, and any other thing that might be around. All have sinned and come short of God, the glory of God. And so this is just reiterating that idea. But being made right by faith says, stop saying in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, into the heavens. Now, this is very mysterious language for us, but it was very meaningful to them. The idea is that, and this is probably ideas taken both from Jewish writings of the time and pagan writings of the time. He said, if you ask who shall ascend into heaven, this is the same as saying, bring Christ down. this is making your, and probably this should be translated, bring the Messiah down. And I probably will change that, because I realize that that's probably what he's talking about. In other words, the Jews wanted to force Christ, the Messiah, to be what they wanted him to be. You should also stop saying, who will descend into the abyss? This is the same as saying, raise Christ from the dead, or raise Messiah from the dead. Again, it's this idea that I'm going to make the plan of God work like I want it to work. So guess who's in control? The person who wants that. At least that's the attraction for it. People want to be able to decide who's going to be what?
To be in control.
To be in control.
To let go and fall into the arms of Christ is very hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's the idea that both Sarah and Rebecca had.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't trying to be malicious. They wanted to do the right thing, but they had to do it in a way that they could understand when they couldn't understand what God
Yeah.
wanted.
I remember that when we had a youth minister here at Oak Hills, when I was preaching, he was one of the best I've ever seen. And he'd go on retreats with high school, junior high and high school age people. And one of the things he had them do is this, they would talk about trust and all, and then he would have them pair off and one stand behind the other and let them just fall back and let the one catch them. That's hard to do. I'm reminded of a joke that a Jewish rabbi told me. There was this Jewish father and Jewish son, and the father put the son up on the chest of drawers. He says, now, Abby, jump, I'll catch you. He said, no, Papa. This is your Papa. You can trust me. Jump. And this went on for about 10 minutes, and finally the kid reluctantly jumped, and the father stepped out of the way and let him hit the floor. He said, that'll teach you, Abby, not to trust nobody. Huh? Yeah. He was making, by the way, it was Rabbi Stahl, who is retired from Temple Beth Israel here in San Antonio, and the last time I knew he was still alive. He was a good friend. And
I wonder who that child became.
What?
I wonder who that child became.
I don't know. He was illustrating a point that I can't remember what the point was. Now, see, that's the thing about having good jokes. To illustrate a point, you can forget the point and remember the joke.
When we were at the University of Austin, in our 2-year-old, we were at the student housing on the 2nd floor, and the 2nd floor had bars so the kids would not fall off but of course 2-year-olds could slip through the bars, and they would slip through the bars and go across the sidewalk to the next bars and slip in so they didn't have to go down the stairs and up the other stairs. Well, our 2-year-old was very precocious, and she did this quite often, and so her father got down on the ground, which also dipped down to another level, and he said, jump. And all the people in our housing came out and said, no, don't tell her to do that. And so they were all standing out there, and he kept on saying, jump, jump. And she looked at him, and she said, no. And when she just said, no, I don't think I'm going to do that.
Yeah. That's like the story Max used in his sermon this weekend about Blondin who walked across the. Yeah, you know what I would tell him if he asked me to get in the wheelbarrow? I say, you don't want me in the wheelbarrow, because I'm so afraid of heights that I'd probably make you fall.
Right.
Okay. But what does it say? The word is near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. Now this is a quotation from the Old Testament, and what Paul is getting at is, you don't have to go down to make the Messiah rise. You don't have to go up to heaven to bring him down, because the Word of God is as close as it can be. And yes, so that all you need to do, whether you're Jew or Gentile, is trust God. It's always been that way. And if you want a rational reason for that, think about this. God depends upon human beings to work out the kingdom on earth. That is, see his rule spread, and he can only use people who trust him enough to do what he says.
I love that, the quote, Christ in you, the hope.
Of it, yeah, yes. So that's his argument here. It's always been, listen to the promise of God. Take your assignment from God. Live your life in accordance with God. You are in the covenant. You've been declared righteous. Now, live it. Start helping other people. Be attractive to the world, not attractive to saying, you go ahead and do what you want to do, but attractive in the sense you have peace and joy and love and faith. When the storm clouds come, you don't panic, because you know your God is in control. When wars come, you can minister to all people, because you know God, your God and your Christ loves all people. You can behave in accord with the grace that was given you. Paul makes that the grace that was given you almost, if not absolutely equivalent. Use the things God made you so that you can reach out to people. God made me a teacher. I'm as convinced of that as almost as I am that he exists. And woe to me if I don't teach. I cannot imagine living and not teaching. Max one time said, Charles, we want you if you have to come here in a wheelchair. So one of these days I may roll in here in a wheelchair, because as long as I live, I'm going to teach. It may be the nurses in the nursing home, but I'm going to teach. I cannot not, and I mean that both as a moral imperative and as a absolute physical need.
Sorry, is that a form of quenching the spirit if you recognize that God's given you a gift and you don't, if you deliberately? Is that
I think that's one of the examples. Is not all that Paul has in mind there, but okay.
I'm reminded of Elijah and his servant when they were surrounded by the Assyrians. The servant was in dire straits. He said, "We need to do something." Also, what Elijah showed him, God's already providing right now. All these things that we want to have, we ask for the presence of God in our lives and His power and His understanding, His wisdom. We have that, it's already here if we'll just open ourselves to it being with us. It's already been provided.
Going back to the text, I just have a question. In verse 3, you have being made right, verse 4, being made right, verse 5, being made right, and verse 6, being made right. Is that all the same Greek word?
Justified. Yes. And I got that from N.T. Wright, and there's a good reason for it. Because we use the word justify, and how many of us have that word in our vocabulary in exactly the same way that the people that spoke Greek did? And it actually literally means to render a verdict of not guilty. It's a law term. And so this is the best way, I think. We are made right. Now that doesn't mean we're made perfect. That is an equivalent to saying we are included in the covenant people of God.
Well, you talked about this when we were going from page 10 to 11, and you said justification was being not guilty but not innocent. Is that something that's implied?
I was using the legal sense. I used that idea that, see, people, and this started among in the followers of Luther, the idea of imputed righteousness. In other words, that we actually became righteous because we took on the righteousness of Christ. And that's simply not what Paul means by it.
But in some texts, they use the word righteousness. And so you're using being made right, and in this, the same place, they're using the word righteous.
Justified.
Yeah. Well, being made right is my translation of the word to justify. Yeah. The righteousness of God is a term that confuses people. And I've got about a minute and a half, 2 minutes, I'm going to talk about this. The righteousness of God, many people think of that as His moral character, or that it's our moral character that He has. But actually, in most places, and in all places in the book of Romans, the righteousness of God means His faithfulness to covenant people.
Why don't they just write that?
What?
Why don't they just put that down instead of confusing?
Well, you'd have to ask.
That's why he's making his translation.
Yeah, that is something that I am translating. That remember, our whole way of life is built upon the fact that God has put us among His covenant people and given us promises that He will keep.
Because He is faithful.
Yes. And let us not relive the mistake of the Jews who believed that being in the covenant people was all that was expected of them. That, if I were going to just really sum up this whole teaching that we've had here, that would be it. That don't make the same mistake the Jews did. Don't think that you are high and too holy to fall.
I think one day at a time, the whole idea that we need to listen one day at a time, read one day at a time.
Well,
Yes, I agree.
you're quoting a pretty good source, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, Alicia.